A dog kept digging a hole in the backyard. The reason will leave you speechless. I remember the exact moment I noticed the first mound of dirt. It was a late afternoon in early spring, the sky tinged with orange and purple as the sun set behind our old oak tree. I was rushing around, trying to gather the last of my laundry from the line, when something caught my eye, a freshly turned patch of earth by the old fence. My dog, Cooper, stood nearby, panting quietly as though he had just finished some great task. At first I thought nothing of it. Dogs dig, it's practically a universal truth. But something about the intensity in Cooper's eyes, the way he kept glancing back at that spot, made a chill run through me. He wasn't just fooling around. He was on a mission. I never expected this seemingly innocent moment to set off a chain of events that would unravel so much more than just soil and grass. But looking back, it's clear that day marked the beginning of a transformation, not only in my dog but in my family, our neighborhood, and the secrets we unwittingly share. The next morning, the hole was noticeably deeper. Cooper had evidently spent much of the night out there, scratching and pawing away under the moonlight. My father, a practical man, sighed heavily at the sight of the torn-up yard. "We're going to have to fill that in before the neighbors start complaining," he grumbled. My mother nodded in agreement, though she wore a puzzled frown. Our yard was spacious, dotted with flower beds and a small vegetable garden, all meticulously cared for. Cooper had never bothered any of it before. When I went out to see what he was doing, Cooper barked at me, a strange mix of eagerness and warning. It was as if he were trying to communicate something that words would never capture. He padded around the hole, nudged the dirt with his nose, then stared right into my eyes. I felt a weird sense of urgency emanating from him, but I couldn't place its source. I knelt beside him, patted his head, and whispered, "What is it, boy? What are you looking for?" Of course, he didn't answer. He just sniffed the air and whined softly. My father filled the hole that afternoon, a process that seemed to agitate Cooper. He circled around, barking and growling as though we were burying something vital. When the last shovel of dirt was packed in, he sat by it, tail low, ears drooping. His entire posture radiated despair. Yet that night, under the shadow of darkness, Cooper went right back to digging, undeterred by our attempts to cover his efforts. I caught him around midnight, illuminated only by the faint glow from the back porch light. He was working with a fervor I'd never seen before, not even when he chased after a rabbit or one of the neighborhood cats. Dirt flew behind him as he dug with mechanical precision, as though each stroke of his paw was following a higher command. Days passed, and the hole became a point of contention in my household. My father was frustrated by the daily repairs he had to do. My mother worried about the neighbors gossiping. Our little suburban community valued neat lawns and decorative fences. The last thing she wanted was to be the talk of the block because of an out-of-control dog. I, on the other hand, felt caught in the middle. Cooper was my best friend, my confidant, the one who greeted me with unbridled joy every time I came home. I couldn't scold him for something that clearly mattered so deeply to him. More than once, I pleaded for patience, explaining that maybe Cooper was trying to tell us something. My parents rolled their eyes, attributing the behavior to nothing more than canine curiosity. And so, a silent war emerged. Every day we filled the hole. Every night Cooper dug it back up. His determination was unwavering, almost obsessive. The lawn began to suffer from the constant disturbance. My father eventually erected a small fence around the area, hoping to dissuade Cooper, but Cooper was undaunted. If there was a boundary, he'd find a way around it or through it. I watched him jump the makeshift fence in a single bound. He scratched at its posts until they loosened. It almost felt like we were trying to contain a force of nature. Meanwhile, there was something else going on beneath the surface, something intangible, a tension or presence that settled over our house like a fine dust. Strange feelings struck me at odd moments. I'd catch sight of Cooper staring off into the distance, ears pricked, as if he heard something we couldn't. Or I'd walk outside to find him sniffing along the fence line, following some trail that didn't exist to human eyes. At night, I woke to the sound of him whining in his sleep, his paws twitching as though he were running from or toward something in his dreams. The neighbors, predictably, began to talk. The Johnsons next door made snide remarks about letting that yard go to the dogs. Across the street, old Mr. Henderson shook his head and tapped his cane on his porch in disapproval. But it wasn't just the gossip that unsettled me. It was the sense that Cooper had tapped into some greater mystery. Day by day, the hole grew larger, deeper, and my dog's eyes shone with an uncanny resolve. I began to spend more time out there with him, trying to understand. There was no foul smell, no sign of rodents or buried treasure, nothing that would justify his frantic excavation. Yet his resolve never wavered. By the second week, the hole was massive, large enough for Cooper to fit into it almost up to his ears. It was a marvel that his paws weren't bleeding from all the digging. It was around this time that I began to have strange dreams. In one dream, I found myself in the backyard at night, except the fence was gone, and the space seemed to stretch infinitely under a moonlit sky. Cooper was there, barking at a spot of ground. I approached, heart pounding, and when I looked into the hole I saw flickers of light, like fireflies dancing in the darkness. In another dream, I heard a distant voice calling my name, low and desperate, as though it came from deep underground. I'd wake in a cold sweat, the echo of that voice fading before I could decipher it. Something was happening, something bigger than any of us had anticipated. When I finally confided in my mother about the nightmares, her face blanched. She confessed she'd been having unsettling dreams as well, ones involving murky shapes lurking by the fence, or the sound of scratching at the windows. "Maybe it's just stress," she said, trying to reassure herself as much as me. My father tried to wave it off as coincidence, but I could see the worry etched on his brow. The entire atmosphere in our home felt charged with an electrical current. At times, I'd walk into a room and feel as though I'd interrupted a silent conversation, like the walls themselves were whispering secrets that dissipated the moment I arrived. Despite all this, no one could have predicted what we would eventually uncover. My father decided enough was enough. One Saturday morning, armed with some plywood, stakes, chicken wire, and even a few cinder blocks, he constructed a more permanent barrier around the hole. It was a fortress of sorts, designed specifically to keep Cooper away. My dog, not one to be easily deterred, spent hours pacing the perimeter, barking in frustration. That night, I half expected him to find a way through the barricade. But for the first time, he seemed to give up. I saw him through my bedroom window, lying down near the fence, his head on his paws. He stared at the structure, only occasionally letting out a disconsolate whine. There was a part of me that felt relief. We would finally have some peace and a chance to regrow the yard. But there was another part, a deeper, more primal part, that felt an inexplicable sense of dread. As if by blocking Cooper, we'd blocked something else that desperately needed to come to light. I found myself tossing and turning that night, sleep slipping through my fingers like sand. Around 3 in the morning, I awoke to the sound of scratching, loud, feral, relentless. Bolting upright, I realized it was coming from the backyard. My heart thundered in my chest. I knew that sound couldn't be from Cooper. He didn't have enough strength to tear through cinder blocks and chicken wire. As I dashed to the window, I heard a crash and a frantic yelp. Down below, the barrier my father had built was swaying as if struck by some immense force. Something was trying to get in or out. I ran outside, not caring that I was still in my pajamas. The night air was cold against my skin. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. I turned on the backyard floodlight, its harsh glare slicing through the darkness. Cooper was there, barking wildly. The makeshift barricade was half toppled, but there was no sign of a trespasser or wild animal. My parents, awakened by the commotion, stumbled out behind me. My father grabbed a flashlight and scanned the yard. For a moment, we all stood there, hearts pounding, uncertain of what might jump out at us. The night was still, eerily so, except for Cooper's growls and whines. Then, to our surprise, we noticed something that made our blood run cold. The hole was no longer just a hole. The earth around it seemed disturbed in a way that went beyond simple digging. It looked as though something was pushing up from underneath, creating a mound that sloped into a dark tunnel. None of us could explain what we were seeing. My mother suggested maybe a large animal, like a groundhog or a fox, had been tunneling beneath the yard. But my father shook his head. This was far too big for any typical burrowing creature. The soil looked inverted, almost as though it had been forcibly displaced from below. Cooper whimpered, pawing at the ground. For a fleeting moment, I caught a strange odor, something metallic and raw, like old pennies mixed with damp earth. It made the hair on my arm stand on end. We decided to leave it until morning, when we could see better. My parents ushered me inside, though I had to practically drag Cooper away from the mound. He stared back over his shoulder as we retreated to the house, ears pinned back in distress. I barely slept. Visions of the mound intruded every time I closed my eyes. There was something profoundly wrong about that earth being pushed up from below, something unnatural. When dawn finally broke, we gathered our tools, shovels, flashlights, a wheelbarrow, and made our way into the yard. Cooper followed anxiously, his tail wagging in a stiff, uneasy rhythm. My father was determined to get to the bottom of whatever was happening, quite literally. We started to dig around the mound, trying to see if there was a tunnel or a cavern beneath. The soil was loose and damp, making it easier to move but also more perilous. One wrong step and we might collapse whatever opening lay beneath. The deeper we went, the more my stomach twisted with an unexplainable apprehension. I noticed small stones placed in odd formations, almost like they were arranged intentionally. There were layers of earth that looked mixed with fragments of roots, shards of pottery, and even old bits of cloth. My father and I exchanged worried glances. This was no simple animal burrow. We were unearthing something with a story behind it, an ancient puzzle with pieces missing. My mother stood back, watching, one hand covering her mouth as though bracing for a dreadful discovery. And then, as we cleared away another layer of dirt, my shovel struck something hard. I froze, heart leaping into my throat. Carefully, we brushed the soil aside. A section of wood came into view, a plank, rotted at the edges. It could have been part of an old box or crate, maybe a piece of a buried fence. Gingerly, we it loose, revealing a space beneath that descended into darkness. Cooper barked, his paws scratching at the wood. Whatever was down there, he wanted to get to it. We crouched low, peering into what looked like a shallow underground chamber. The air that rushed up smelled stale, like a tomb sealed off for years. My father grabbed his flashlight and aimed it inside. The beam revealed dirt walls, cobwebs, and in the corner, something that made us all step back in shock: bones. At first, I wasn't sure what kind of bones they were. Long, slender, too big for a cat, too small for a large dog. My father's face blanched. My mother clutched my arm, trembling. Carefully, we climbed down into the hole, shining the flashlight around. The more we looked, the more we found, small bones scattered about, some grouped together in bundles. My mother's voice quivered. Are they human? My father shook his head, uncertain. It was hard to tell under the dim light, coated in dirt and time. We called the local authorities, who arrived with an air of solemnity. The yard we'd once cherished as a peaceful retreat was now a crime scene. They cordoned off the area, brought in specialists, and carefully began the process of excavating the site. Cooper was frantic, barking at the officers, trying to squeeze past them and get back to the hole. I had to hold him by the collar to keep him away. My heart pounded as the experts sifted through soil. Each item revealed a potential piece of a grim puzzle. We watched from the sidelines, too numb to process what was happening. It took hours of painstaking work before they confirmed that the bones were animal remains, several animals, in fact, likely strays. Relief washed over us, followed by a new wave of horror. Who would bury multiple animals in our backyard? And why? One of the officers suggested it might be the work of someone with a hoarding problem, or worse, a person who had been performing some bizarre ritual. The entire situation felt surreal, like we'd stumbled onto the set of a twisted thriller. The team continued digging, determined to ensure they weren't missing any human remains. Eventually, they found something else. An old wooden box about the size of a shoebox, tightly sealed. The hinges were rusted, the wood warped from years underground. No one said a word as they it open. Inside were scraps of fabric, a few disintegrating photographs, and a stack of yellowed letters bound by a ribbon. The lead investigator, a woman with steely eyes, carefully lifted the letters. She glanced at us, a mixture of pity and curiosity on her face. "We'll need to look through these," she said gently. My father just nodded, too stunned to speak. The photographs, though faded and water-damaged, showed hints of smiling faces, people dressed in old-fashioned clothing. My mother gasped softly, pointing to one image that looked alarmingly like the front of our house, many decades ago. The box was carried off to be analyzed further, leaving us with more questions than answers. That night the backyard felt eerie, like it was inhabited by the ghosts of whatever secrets we had partially unearthed. The hole, now a gaping pit, was covered with a tarp. Cooper lay beside it, refusing to eat or drink. I sat next to him, stroking his fur, trying to ease his agitation. In the distance, I could still see the flashlights of the investigators, combing over every inch of our once normal yard. In a trembling voice, I whispered, "What did you find, boy? Why were you so determined?" He rested his head on my lap, his brown eyes reflecting a sadness that made my chest tighten. Over the next week, our home turned into a flurry of police interviews, local reporters lurking with cameras, and neighbors gawking from the sidewalk. Each day brought new tidbits of information. The letters in the wooden box, written in a loopy, old-fashioned script, belonged to a woman named Sarah Burton. Dated around the 1950s, they told a haunting story of heartbreak and loss. Sarah wrote about her husband, Robert, who had returned from the war a changed man, haunted by nightmares, prone to violent outbursts. She described how, late at night, he'd wander outside, muttering to himself. Sometimes she'd wake to find him digging holes in the yard, burying things he deemed tainted by evil. The letters mentioned animals, cats, dogs, even wild creatures, some of which Robert had killed, convinced they were possessed by malevolent spirits. Sarah had begged him to stop, threatened to leave if he didn't seek help, but his paranoia only grew. The final letter was the most chilling. In it, Sarah wrote, "I fear for my life and for our unborn child. Robert has become entirely unhinged. The holes he digs are endless. He tells me he's saving us from the devils that lurk in the shadows. I can't sleep. I can't think. I have no one to turn to. If anyone finds this, please understand I did all I could to stop him." That letter ended abruptly, splattered with dark stains that could have been ink or something else. The investigators scoured old records and eventually discovered that Sarah Burton had never been reported missing, but her name vanished from local directories in the mid-1950s. Robert Burton was listed as a widower in 1957 before he, too, disappeared, presumably to another state or possibly under a different name. No record of their child existed. The case had gone cold decades ago, overshadowed by the chaos of the post-war era and overshadowed by the expansion of our suburban neighborhood. Our family was in shock. We'd had no idea our property once belonged to a man so tormented by his own demons. As word spread, the neighborhood's reaction was mixed. Some were horrified, others intrigued by the lurid details. A sense of unease settled over everyone. We began to question the very ground beneath our feet. Could Robert have done more than just bury animals? Had Sarah truly escaped, or was she still here, resting beneath the silent soil? During this time, Cooper's behavior shifted from restless digging to a somber vigilance. He stopped trying to excavate the hole, instead keeping watch over it. More than once, I woke to find him standing guard under the moonlight, ears perked, listening. His gaze was distant, as if attuned to frequencies beyond human hearing. I couldn't help but wonder if he sensed something else down there, something that had yet to be discovered. As the days turned into weeks, the police concluded their excavation, having found no human remains. They left us with the unsettling knowledge of the Burtons' tragic story and a recommendation to re-landscape the yard once the investigation was closed. My parents tried to return to normalcy. They hired a landscaping company to fill the hole, remove the makeshift barricades, and restore our backyard to something resembling its former state. But even as fresh sod was laid down and the earth was smoothed over, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were merely covering up something that would never truly rest. My nightmares intensified. Each night I dreamt of Sarah Burton, her face contorted in silent screams, begging for help. In some dreams I saw the dog Cooper had replaced, a phantom presence, leading me to the spot where the box had been found. Often the night sky in these dreams would be tinged with red, and the air tasted of metal. I spoke to my parents about it. My mother, pale-faced, admitted she, too, was having nightmares about a crying woman. My father, ever stoic, said little, though dark circles under his eyes hinted at his own troubled sleep. The tension in the house was a coiled spring. Even trivial arguments turned heated. My mother would break down crying for no apparent reason. My father grew more irritable, snapping at the smallest annoyance. And Cooper, he remained watchful, alert. Sometimes I'd catch him prowling the halls at night, sniffing at closed doors, as if searching for a hidden intruder. Despite the yard being filled in, something still lingered. It was like a weight pressing down on the very soul of our home. One stormy evening, when the wind howled and rain battered against the windows, everything came to a head. We lost power around midnight, the house plunged into an oppressive darkness. I lay in bed, heart thumping, as thunder rattled the window panes. Lightning flashed, illuminating the walls in brief, stark bursts. That was when I heard it, a scratching sound, faint at first, almost drowned out by the storm. I thought it might be branches scraping against the house, but the noise grew louder, more insistent. Carefully, I crept downstairs, guided by the flicker of lightning. Cooper was at the back door, barking frantically. The hair on his back stood up, and he kept pawing at the glass. Through a flash of lightning, I glimpsed the backyard. My stomach lurched. Even in the downpour, I could make out a dark shape moving across the lawn. It wasn't a person. The silhouette was hunched, almost crawling, and it moved with an unsettling grace that made my skin crawl. Another flash of lightning, and it was gone. Yet the backyard gate stood open, swaying in the wind, inviting whatever that shape was to come inside. My father rushed into the kitchen, alarmed by Cooper's barking. My mother appeared shortly after, clutching a flashlight that sputtered weakly. "Did you see that?" I asked, voice trembling. My father nodded grimly, flipping the flashlight's beam around the dark yard, but we saw nothing. Cooper wouldn't stop barking, scratching at the door to be let out. Normally, he hated storms, preferring to hide under blankets. Now, he was desperate to confront whatever lurked outside. Against my better judgment, I slid the door open. Cooper bolted into the night, barking wildly as thunder boomed overhead. The three of us followed, flashlights bobbing, rain drenching us within seconds. Wind whipped at our clothes and the ground squelched beneath our feet. My father shouted for Cooper, the storm swallowing his voice. Lightning streaked across the sky, revealing for an instant the old fence line and the restored patch of earth where the hole had been. Cooper was there, paws digging frantically, mud flying. A moan of wind curled around us, sounding almost human. We sprinted to him, slipping on the wet grass. To our collective horror, the earth had begun to sink again, forming a shallow depression. Cooper, with a renewed sense of urgency, was clawing at it, ignoring the driving rain and thunder. My father tried to pull him away, but Cooper snapped at him, not out of aggression, but out of desperate insistence. He wanted us to see something. With shaking hands, I pointed the flashlight downward. The beam illuminated the depression, revealing what looked like another plank of wood, slick with mud. Had we missed a second chamber during the earlier excavation? Heart hammering, we helped Cooper clear the mud. Sure enough, there was more wood, similar to the rotted plank we'd found weeks earlier. My father used a crowbar from the garage to pry it open. The wind shrieked as if in protest. A foul stench hit us, unmistakably the odor of decay. Gagging, we aimed our flashlights into the darkness below. A small chamber almost extended beneath us. In the flickering beams, we saw something that made my mother drop her flashlight. There, in a makeshift shroud of tattered cloth, lay what appeared to be a human figure, small and heartbreakingly frail. My knees buckled at the realization. This was a child's remains. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in harsh, strobing light. My mother screamed, collapsing against my father. Cooper whined, backing away, as though even he could sense the profound anguish emanating from that space. The remains were partially preserved, the child's tiny hands clutching a ragged doll. My throat tightened to the point of pain. This was Sarah Burton's child, the one who never made it into any official records. In that instant, everything clicked. Robert Burton, mad with paranoia, had not only been burying animals but had also buried something far more precious and far more damning. Nausea churned in my stomach as the storm raged overhead. My father, trembling, reached for his phone, but the rain had soaked it through. We needed to call the authorities. My mother sobbed quietly, her tears lost in the deluge of rain. Cooper stood guard, eyes fixed on the tiny form below, as though paying silent respect. A surge of indescribable sorrow washed over me. The entire narrative of Sarah Burton's life crashed upon me like a wave. She must have died or been killed, or perhaps she had escaped, leaving the child behind. The specifics were unknown, but the heartbreak was undeniable. We had unearthed the darkest secret of our home, the final piece in a haunting story that spanned decades. Somehow, we managed to contact the police once we got back inside. By the time they arrived, the storm had begun to subside, leaving the yard a muddy mess of footprints and debris. The child's remains were handled with reverence, taken away to be identified and given a proper resting place. The investigation reopened with renewed intensity. The media descended upon our street once again, broadcasting the grim discovery to anyone who cared to listen. The entire neighborhood buzzed with shock and morbid fascination. For our family, the emotional toll was immense. My mother could hardly sleep. My father, always stoic, was haunted by guilt, as though he'd personally failed the long-dead child. And me, I felt like I was living in a waking nightmare. Scenes of that tiny, shrouded form replayed in my mind day and night. Yet, amidst all the sorrow and turmoil, there was one small comfort: Cooper. He no longer tried to dig, no longer paced the yard in desperation. It was as if his mission was complete. He spent his time comforting us, resting his head on our knees, following us quietly around the house, ensuring none of us were ever alone with our thoughts for too long. In the ensuing weeks, more details emerged. Forensic analysis suggested the child had been dead for decades, consistent with the timeline of the Burtons. There was also evidence of foul play, though no official statement named Robert Burton as the culprit. It was simply the strongest suspicion. Various distant relatives of the Burtons came forward, some claiming ignorance, others offering speculation. The child's remains were eventually claimed by a great-niece of Sarah Burton, who arranged a small, private funeral. We were invited, and though attending was unbearably heartbreaking, we felt it was the least we could do. At the funeral, held at a weathered cemetery on the edge of town, I placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the tiny coffin. My mother sobbed quietly, clinging to my father's arm. The great-niece recounted family legends, describing Sarah as a sweet woman who married too young and faced a tidal wave of tragedy. She mentioned rumors of Robert's deteriorating mental health, his possible PTSD from the war, and how it may have escalated into a full psychosis. It was a solemn gathering, only a handful of us there to mourn a life lost before it ever truly began. After the ceremony, I felt a sense of finality settle over me, though my heart still ached for the child and for Sarah. Cooper sat with us near the gravesite, quietly watching. I couldn't help but think of him as the unlikely hero in all of this. Without his relentless digging, that child might have remained hidden forever, even the simple dignity of a known grave. On the drive home, my mother voiced a thought that had been growing in my own mind. Perhaps Cooper had sensed a restless spirit or an unresolved presence, guiding him to unearth the truth. My father, ever practical, just nodded solemnly. Whether it was dog instinct, spiritual intervention, or sheer coincidence, we would never know. But we all felt an odd mixture of sadness and relief that the secret was finally laid bare. In the weeks that followed, life in our household slowly regained a sense of normalcy. The yard was restored once again, this time with real care. We planted a small memorial garden over the spot where the child had been found, a tiny marker with a single inscription. Rest in peace. The atmosphere in our home felt lighter, the oppressive tension lifted. My mother's nightmares subsided, and even my father slept more soundly. As for Cooper, he returned to his playful, loving self. He'd lounge in the sunny parts of the yard, wagging his tail at anyone passing by. Yet there was a subtle depth to his gaze now, a quiet wisdom that hinted at an experience few could understand. When children from the neighborhood came over to play, he greeted them gently, as though he recognized just how fragile young life could be. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of the old fence line, the place where the hole had once been, and a chill would sweep through me. I'd recall the countless nights of digging, the letters in that weathered box, the bones of innocent animals, and the final, heartbreaking discovery. The question that lingered most for me was what became of Sarah Burton. Had she escaped her husband's cruelty, only to spend the rest of her life grieving the loss of her child? Or was she, too, buried somewhere nearby, her spirit as restless as the child's had been? We had no concrete answers, only the comfort of knowing that, at least in part, the truth had emerged from the darkness. Months later, a local historian reached out to us, asking for permission to include our story in a documentary about the hidden histories of suburban neighborhoods. My parents were hesitant at first, wary of reliving the trauma. But in the end, they agreed that shining a light on these dark chapters of history might offer solace or understanding to someone else. The historian spent hours interviewing us, capturing every detail of Cooper's strange persistence, the emotional that followed, and the ultimate discovery that set a tiny soul free. Through the process of recounting the events, we found a sense of closure. It felt good to talk about Sarah Burton's letters, to speculate on her life, and to grieve in our own way for the child who never had a chance. Cooper, star of the documentary, received extra pats and treats during the filming. He, of course, had no idea that his actions had become a local legend. Some nights, even after we'd come to terms with it all, I'd stand by the back window, gazing at the spot where the tragedy had been buried. The moonlight would cast long shadows across the grass, and in the faint rustle of leaves, I imagined I could hear a whisper, soft and forlorn. I'd think about the countless secrets that might lie hidden beneath suburban lawns across the world. How many more stories were waiting to be told? How many more restless spirits yearned to be found? Yet, in those quiet moments, I also felt a warmth, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the soul of that lost child had finally found peace. The heartbreak of discovering something so dark on our property had ironically drawn us closer together as a family. We hugged more often, said, "I love you," without hesitation. Cooper became a reminder of how love and loyalty can transcend even the darkest secrets. One late evening, as I sat on the porch step, Cooper rested his head on my knee. The crickets chirped a peaceful melody, and a gentle breeze ruffled the leaves. The night sky was clear, countless stars twinkling overhead. I felt tears well in my eyes, a complex mix of sadness for the past and gratitude for the present. I whispered into the stillness, Thank you, boy. Thank you for not giving up." Cooper's tail thumped softly against the porch as if acknowledging my words. And so, our story became a testament to the unseen battles fought in the quiet corners of the world, the silent tragedies that unfold behind closed doors, and the resilience of a faithful dog who dared to dig deeper. It was a tale that people around town would retell in hushed tones, sometimes with skepticism, sometimes with awe. But to us, it was simply our life, a life forever changed by the day Cooper started digging and wouldn't stop. Though time passed, the echoes of that discovery never fully left our house. Every so often, when a strong wind blew or a particular beam of sunlight fell across the garden, my mother would stand by the window, lost in thought. My father took to reading old historical documents, possibly hoping to learn more about Robert and Sarah Burton, to fill in the blanks of their tragic narrative. And I, whenever I felt overwhelmed by the memory, found comfort in Cooper's steady presence. He reminded me that even in the face of horror, love remains a guiding force, and sometimes that love leads us to uncover truths that must come to light, no matter how painful. At school, friends asked me about the drama. They'd heard rumors, seen news clips. Some were wide-eyed with curiosity, others awkwardly sympathetic. It was difficult to summarize such an emotional journey in a casual conversation. Often I just shrugged and said it was something we were all still processing. Deep down, I longed for them to understand the layers of this experience, the heartbreak, the terror, the relief, the unexplainable connection between Cooper and what lay beneath our yard. But as the seasons shifted and the grass grew lush over the once gaping hole, life marched forward. We celebrated birthdays, holidays, and the simple joy of quiet weekends. Sometimes at gatherings with neighbors or friends, the topic of that dog who found the buried child would come up. It had become a local legend, the kind that fades into folklore over time. Yet for us, it was all too real. One breezy autumn afternoon, I took Cooper for a walk in the neighborhood. Leaves crackled underfoot, and a crisp scent of change hung in the air. We passed by the old houses, each with their own unspoken stories. I noticed new families, children laughing in front yards, dogs barking from porches. Life, with all its complexity, continued unabated. And I thought about how, beneath the cheerful veneer of everyday life, sorrow and secrets might lurk, waiting for someone, or some devoted dog, to bring them to light. As we rounded the corner back to our street, I felt a pang in my chest. I wondered if the child we found would have enjoyed days like this, running through autumn leaves, giggling at the swirl of orange and gold. A tear slid down my cheek, but it was accompanied by a gentle smile of gratitude. Because while we couldn't rewrite the past, we'd at least given that lost life a voice, a chance to be acknowledged by the living world. At home, Cooper and I sat on the porch again. He settled beside me, enjoying the sunshine. I stroked his ears and looked out over the yard. It was beautiful, the new grass plush and green, the small memorial garden blooming with fall chrysanthemums. It was hard to believe that such a dark secret had once been buried there. I closed my eyes, inhaled the fresh air, and let myself simply be in that moment. For all the heartache, there was also a serene knowledge that some measure of peace had been won. A few weeks later, we received a letter from a genealogical society working with Sarah Burton's great-niece. They wanted to thank us for our part in unearthing the truth. Enclosed was a copy of an old photograph they'd managed to restore digitally. It was Sarah, standing in front of our house, smiling, hands clasped over a small bump in her dress. The baby was on the way. Her eyes shone with hope, unaware of the horrors that awaited. My mother cried when she saw it. My father quietly placed the photo in a frame, setting it next to the memorial marker in the garden. We never forgot her name. Time became a friend, slowly healing the raw edges of our emotions. The nightmares faded. Our family grew stronger. Cooper continued to thrive, basking in the love and affection we showered upon him. Sometimes I'd catch him lying in the sun near the memorial garden, his ears perked, as though listening to something I couldn't hear. Perhaps he was standing guard over that resting place, ensuring nothing else remained hidden or disturbed. Perhaps he was simply enjoying the warmth of the day. Either way, it brought me an unspoken comfort. In quiet moments, I'd recall the stormy night, the terrifying glimpse of a dark shape in our yard, and the final discovery that turned our world upside down. I'd replay the image of that child's tiny form beneath the rotted wood, clutching a doll in eternal silence. But I'd also recall the bravery of a dog who wouldn't stop digging, who persisted against all odds. And I'd remember how my family clung to each other when our illusions of suburban bliss shattered. Those memories, as painful as they were, shaped who we became. Eventually, the story of Cooper and the hidden grave became more than just local gossip. It evolved into a parable of sorts, about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, about facing the buried darkness that haunts us, about how love can be found even in the midst of unimaginable sorrow. Whenever people asked if we regretted letting Cooper dig that hole, we shook our heads firmly. Yes, it unleashed a storm of pain and questions, but it also allowed a forgotten child to be seen, to be mourned, and finally to be laid to rest. Years passed. I grew older, went off to college, carrying the memory of that summer with me. I'd often look back on it when life got complicated. It reminded me that sometimes the things we bury, our fears, our traumas, our secrets, have a way of surfacing. And that maybe it's better to face them rather than let them fester. Cooper stayed with my parents, aging gracefully. He was slower, a bit arthritic, but his spirit remained the same. Every time I visited, he'd greet me with that unwavering devotion only a dog can muster. During one of those visits, my father pulled me aside. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We owe Cooper more than we can ever repay. He saved us in a way." I nodded, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. There were no words to fully capture my gratitude for that dog, who unknowingly became our guide through a labyrinth of buried truths. My father gave me a small smile. "Just remember," he said, "no matter what life buries, it's never truly gone. Sometimes all it takes is someone or something with enough heart to dig it back up." And so life marched on, carrying us forward. The seasons changed. New families moved in and out of the neighborhood. Children grew tall and went off to forge their own paths. But in our home, we carried a legacy of compassion and curiosity, inherited from a dog who refused to let secrets stay hidden. On warm summer evenings, when the dusk glowed with fireflies, we'd gather in the backyard to share stories. Inevitably, someone would mention the digging. We'd smile and remember how that simple act, so ordinary for a dog, had shaken our world and opened our eyes to a hidden chapter of human tragedy and resilience. In time, Cooper passed on. It was peaceful in his sleep, after a long life well lived. We buried him in the memorial garden, wrapping him in a blanket he loved, placing a few of his favorite toys beside him. Tears mingled with fond memories as we said our goodbyes. I could almost see him bounding in an endless field somewhere, free of pain, free of burdens, his nose sniffing for hidden wonders that only he could sense. It felt right to lay him to rest in the very spot where he had fulfilled his purpose. Standing by Cooper's grave, I thought about the circle of life and death, the hidden and the revealed, the hearts that break and the love that endures. I realized that the reason Cooper kept digging all those years ago went beyond mere instincts or supernatural guidance. He was, at his core, a being driven by loyalty and love. In giving voice to a child who had none, he showed us what it means to care deeply, to stand unyielding in the face of darkness. Even now, as I pen these words, I'm filled with gratitude. Gratitude for the dog who taught us to confront our buried truths. Gratitude for the child who, though gone long before my time, reminded me of life's fragility. And gratitude for the family who stood together, battered by storms, yet unbroken. This story, our story, has become a testament to the power of love, the weight of secrets, and the miracles that can unfold when we're brave enough to unearth what lies beneath. For those who hear it, let it serve as a reminder. Sometimes the simplest of creatures can reveal the greatest mysteries. Sometimes a dog digging a hole is more than just a dog digging a hole. And most importantly, when we come face to face with the tragedies of the past, we must remember that compassion and truth are the light that guides us through even the deepest of shadows.